November 17, 1944. The Moselle River glistened gray beneath a low, winter sun. You can almost hear the water gurgling over jagged rocks, the cold biting through uniforms, tanks, and boots alike. Across its banks, German artillery officers laughed. The Americans, they believed they could cross this river in force. A handful of M4 Sherman tanks, lightly armored, slow, and vulnerable. It was absurd. From the ridge above, General von Braun and his staff surveyed the valley. They had fortified every conceivable crossing. Mines buried beneath mud, artillery positions braced, machine gun nests hidden in trees. In their minds, the Moselle was a moat that no Sherman could breach, no matter how fast the Americans dreamed. And yet, far below, an American engineer corps scurried along the riverbank, working as if the Wehrmacht didn't exist. Among them was Captain John Harrison, a wiry officer with a reputation for improvisation. Pontoon sections clattered against rocks. Men shouted over the roar of the river. Sparks from welding torches danced in the cold morning like tiny stars, fragile, almost defiant. You could see the doubt in the German commanders' eyes, but they hid it behind discipline. Let them try, von Braun murmured. They will fail. They always fail. And then, as if testing fate itself, the first Sherman approached. Mud clung to its treads, engines growling. Men inside gripped controls tight, knuckles white. The pontoon bridge, a simple steel and wood structure, waited to support hundreds of tons of American armor. Every heartbeat matched the rhythm of the river below, surging and threatening to tear the bridge apart. The Sherman inched forward. The Germans laughed at first, thinking the tank would bog down or fall into the current. But the bridge held, and then another tank and another. The laughter faded. The rivers, which had seemed impossible to cross, were now being claimed by the Americans. Patton's engineers weren't just crossing. They were redefining what the Germans thought possible. With each Sherman rolling safely onto the far bank, disbelief spread like wildfire through the enemy ranks. From the ridge, you could see the subtle shift, smiles fading, hands gripping binoculars harder, calculations running frantically in real time. Yet the river was only the beginning. For every bridge laid, every Sherman crossed, the question loomed. Could the Americans maintain this momentum? Could they exploit this daring crossing before German firepower reclaimed the advantage? Mini cliffhanger. Would von Braun's fortified positions crumble under audacity? Or would the rivers finally swallow Patton's armored divisions whole? By midday, the Moselle's calm surface had become a battlefield stage. Sherman after Sherman rumbled across the pontoon bridges, engines growling, treads churning mud and water alike. The German commanders had started the morning with derisive laughter, shaking their heads at what they called tin cans on wheels. But now, binoculars pressed to their eyes, the laughter vanished. Faces hardened. Panic began to creep in. From the American side, Captain Harrison and his engineers worked feverishly. Every bridge had to hold. Every plank and steel beam could mean life or death for the tanks barreling toward the German positions. The river's current was stronger than most officers anticipated. Trees and debris floated downstream, threatening to tear apart hastily assembled pontoons. Men shouted over the roar, adjusting lines, reinforcing weak points, welding and hammering with relentless precision. Meanwhile, on the opposite bank, the German 15th Panzer Grenadier Division scrambled to react. Orders shouted over radios. Guns swung into position. But it was too late. The Americans were already pouring across, a rolling tide of armor that the Wehrmacht had never expected. Von Braun's earlier confidence, that smug belief in the Sherman's vulnerability, began to crumble. Tanks that were supposed to stall, bog down, or be destroyed were instead advancing faster than his calculations allowed. Patton's genius wasn't just in the tanks themselves. It was in the audacity of the crossing, the speed of the engineers, the relentless push forward. For every Sherman that made it across, another point of panic spread along the German lines. Maps were consulted, reserves moved, artillery recalculated, but the Americans were always one step ahead. It was as if the rivers themselves had betrayed the defenders. Inside one Sherman, Lieutenant Frank Donovan leaned over the controls, heart hammering. He could hear the distant staccato of machine gun fire, the whistle of incoming shells, but also the low rumble of his comrades rolling behind him. Every hedge and riverbank, every obstacle the Germans had assumed was insurmountable, was being swept aside. And all around him, men who had mocked the American tanks hours earlier were now scrambling in disbelief. The first breach had been made. The Moselle, once a natural barrier, had become a highway for armored divisions. Engineers and tank crews alike shared a fleeting glance, exhaustion, adrenaline, and awe mingling in silent acknowledgement. They knew they had done something impossible. But the war waits for no one. The Germans were still regrouping. Reinforcements were moving. Artillery barrages were imminent. Crossing one river was one thing, sustaining the advance, keeping momentum, and turning disbelief into a rout would demand even more ingenuity. Mini cliffhanger. Could Patton's engineers maintain this momentum? Or would German artillery and counterattacks finally stop the Shermans where the Moselle had just been conquered? March 7, 1945. The Rhine River stretched wide and unyielding, a steel-gray barrier that had long been the backbone of Germany's defensive line. You can almost hear the water slapping against the banks, taste the icy spray in the air, feel the wind slicing across the men's faces. From the far side, German officers scowled through binoculars, certain that no Sherman, no pontoon, no ingenuity could breach this final frontier. But Patton's engineers had learned from the Moselle. Lessons burned into memory. The current could be tamed, bridges could be built under fire, tanks could cross against all odds. Captain Harrison and his crew worked feverishly again, assembling pontoon bridges with military precision, the river churning like a living thing beneath their feet. Sparks from welding torches flew into the cold morning like fleeting stars, marking the rhythm of relentless determination. And then the first Sherman roared onto the bridge. Steel groaned under its weight. Mud and debris clung to the treads. German artillery opened fire, but it was too late. The bridge held. And behind it, wave after wave of tanks, trucks, and armored personnel carriers began their march. What had started as ridicule in the German command tent was now raw, unmasked panic. Field Marshal von Kluge's staff shouted orders, repositioning artillery, calling for reinforcements. But the Americans were already moving faster than the Germans could respond. The Rhine, thought to be impenetrable, had become another road to defeat. Every Sherman that rolled safely across the pontoon bridge was another blow to the morale of men who had once mocked them. Inside one tank, Lieutenant Frank Donovan could see the fear in the eyes of German soldiers dug into the riverbank. They had expected an easy kill. Instead, the Americans were everywhere, crossing rivers, overrunning positions, and rewriting what was considered possible. Patton's brilliance wasn't just in the strategy. It was in the audacity, in exploiting the disbelief of the enemy, in making the impossible look inevitable. The crossing was more than a tactical maneuver. It was psychological warfare. German generals who had sneered at those fragile American tanks now frantically recalculated the fate of the Rhine defenses. Reports flew up the chain of command. Armored divisions had crossed faster than expected, artillery positions were being bypassed, bridges were held, and the Americans were advancing inland at a pace no one had predicted. For the soldiers on the bank, the sound of engines and the sight of tanks cutting through the river mist was electrifying. Every passing Sherman shouted a single truth. The war could not be contained by rivers or rigid assumptions. And for Patton, it was confirmation of a lesson he had long known: speed, surprise, and unorthodox thinking could turn natural barriers into highways of triumph. Mini cliffhanger. Would the Rhine crossing mark the beginning of Germany's collapse, or would desperate counterattacks finally halt the unstoppable Shermans? March 10, 1945. The morning sun cut weakly through gray clouds over the Rhine. The river's current glimmered cold and relentless, but on its banks something had shifted. German generals who had mocked the American Shermans now sat tensely in command tents, faces drawn and pale. Maps were scattered across tables. Radios crackled with reports of tanks advancing where none should have dared. Laughter had turned to panic and panic to disbelief. The Americans, meanwhile, pressed their advantage. Sherman after Sherman poured across the pontoon bridges, engines growling, treads tearing through mud and debris. Infantry followed close behind, using the armored divisions as shields against scattered artillery fire. It was a symphony of coordinated chaos, speed, ingenuity, and audacity fused into a force the Wehrmacht had never encountered. Captain Harrison watched from the bridgehead, hands clenched on the railing, heart hammering. He knew what the Germans believed, that lightly armored Shermans would falter against entrenched positions, that rivers would halt their advance. He also knew what he had built: bridges that could hold, tanks that could cross, and soldiers ready to exploit the opening. With every passing moment, the German facade of invincibility crumbled. Field Marshal von Kluge and his staff could only scramble. Artillery was repositioned, reserves were mobilized, yet it was too late. The Shermans were already deep inland, cutting supply lines, outflanking strongpoints, turning Germany's carefully prepared rivers into nothing more than speed bumps. The mocking laughter that had once echoed through command posts was gone, replaced by frantic orders, whispered fears, and the growing realization that they had underestimated not just the tanks, but the men behind them. For the Americans on the ground, it was a triumph of ingenuity and courage. One man's engineers, one captain's bridge crews, one general's willingness to push boundaries, all combined to turn ridicule into legend. Across the Rhine, what began as impossibility had become unstoppable momentum. And yet in the quiet moments, the soldiers knew the war was far from over. Each river crossed, each obstacle overcome brought them closer to victory, but also deeper into enemy territory. The Germans were not defeated yet, and the cost of pushing too fast, too far, could be catastrophic. Mini cliffhanger. How long could the Shermans sustain this pace before Germany struck back? Could audacity alone carry the Third Army across the final defenses of the fatherland? March 12, 1945. The Rhine's banks were littered with evidence of chaos and disbelief. Sherman tanks, once mocked as lightly armored tins, now rumbled inland like unstoppable beasts, their treads carving tracks across mud, stone, and debris. Engineers and infantry surged behind them, a wave of coordinated force that the Germans had never anticipated. From laughter to panic, from confidence to dread, the transformation in the enemy command was complete. General Patton watched from an observation post, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Smoke from the river crossings rose in thin columns, mingling with the mist. Every Sherman that crossed, every pontoon bridge successfully held, validated his vision. Speed and audacity could shatter what seemed invincible. For the German generals, the Moselle had been the rehearsal, the Rhine the curtain call. Their maps, their calculations, even their confidence, all were obsolete. On the ground, soldiers could sense the change in the enemy. German resistance, once disciplined and mocking, began to falter. Units retreated in disarray. Artillery positions abandoned. Small pockets of infantry surrendered when faced with the relentless advance of tanks they had once laughed at. The Rhine was no longer a boundary. It had become a gateway to the heart of Germany. Inside a Sherman, Lieutenant Donovan felt the rhythm of the advance in every shudder of the tank. The river crossings had been harrowing, yes, but now the pace quickened. Every mile gained pressed the Germans further into panic, eroding their ability to respond, to regroup, to resist. This was more than a tactical victory. It was psychological warfare executed in full view. One man's audacity, a few engineers' skill, and a corps of Sherman tanks had rewritten the rules of engagement. By evening, the Third Army had established multiple bridgeheads across the Rhine, opening corridors for infantry, artillery, and supply lines. The German generals could only watch, powerless, as what they had mocked became the foundation of the final Allied push into the Reich. From disbelief to awe, from arrogance to defeat, the river crossings had proven that ingenuity and determination could outmatch even the most fortified defenses. And in the quiet moments after the last tank rumbled across the Rhine, soldiers whispered among themselves, a shared acknowledgement. History had just been made. The mocked tanks, the laughed-at engineers, the audacious plan, all had combined to turn what Germany considered impassable into a highway of victory. Mini cliffhanger. Could this momentum carry the Allies straight into the heart of Germany? Or was one final, desperate counterattack still waiting to challenge the unstoppable Shermans? March 15, 1945. In the German High Command, tension had replaced all pretense of control. Maps were marked with red excess and frantic notations. Reports came in from every sector. Shermans had crossed rivers no one thought possible, bridgeheads were expanding, and American armored divisions moved faster than anyone could contain. The generals who had once mocked Patton's tanks now sat in stunned silence, realizing they had underestimated not just the Americans' machinery, but their audacity. Von Kluge paced the room, hand pressed to his forehead, eyes scanning a sea of numbers that no longer added up. "They move where they should not," he muttered, almost to himself. Orders to counterattack were rushed, yet they lacked coordination, arriving too late, often to empty fields. Every river, every obstacle, every natural defense Germany had relied upon had been neutralized, not by massed artillery, not by overwhelming force, but by speed, ingenuity, and relentless execution. Meanwhile, Patton's Shermans didn't pause. The tanks thundered along cleared roads, their engines droning like war drums, a constant reminder that the Americans dictated the tempo. Engineers and infantry followed close behind, repairing bridges, clearing debris, and pressing forward without hesitation. The Rhine crossings had been the ultimate test, and they had passed with resounding success. Across the battlefield, German soldiers began abandoning positions, surrendering rather than facing tanks they had once dismissed as laughably inadequate. It was a domino effect. Morale crumbling, confidence shattered, command paralyzed. What began as ridicule had spiraled into fear, and now into collapse. Patton, ever the observer of human nature, knew the psychological impact was as important as the physical victory. The Germans were now chasing shadows, reacting to moves they could no longer predict. And every Sherman crossing, every bridge laid, every mile gained pushed them closer to a total collapse of their defensive line. The American soldiers, exhausted but elated, knew they were witnessing more than a tactical maneuver. They were witnessing the undoing of a defensive myth, the invulnerability of German rivers, the supremacy of entrenched positions, the assumed fragility of their tanks. The mockery of the past had been replaced with awe, fear, and the undeniable truth. Audacity, speed, and ingenuity had conquered what everyone said was impossible. Mini cliffhanger. Germany's strongest natural defenses had fallen, but could Patton's momentum be maintained all the way into the heart of the Reich, or was one final desperate gamble still looming? March 18, 1945. The sun barely pierced the gray winter sky, casting long shadows across shattered towns and smoke-choked riversides. Sherman tanks rolled through streets once thought safe by the Wehrmacht, their engines shaking loose centuries of complacency. You can almost hear the echoes of panic that once filled German command posts, now replaced with silence, broken only by distant artillery and the relentless rumble of armor. Patton's Third Army had done the unthinkable. Rivers that had been considered insurmountable were now corridors of conquest. Each crossing had delivered more than tanks. It had delivered psychological shock. German generals, once confident in their fortifications and artillery, were now chasing ghosts. Every Sherman that pressed forward deepened the sense of inevitability. The Americans were unstoppable, and the Germans had no plan that could outpace this audacity. Behind the armored advance, infantry units moved swiftly, clearing streets, securing towns, and cutting off German retreats. Engineers rebuilt bridges as fast as they were destroyed. Supply trucks followed, keeping the armored divisions fed, armed, and moving. Momentum had become a weapon, a force that the Wehrmacht could neither predict nor contain. Inside one Sherman, Lieutenant Donovan and his crew exchanged glances, exhaustion and adrenaline mingling in their eyes. Every crossing, every hedge, every river conquered had been a test, and each one had proven that audacity, ingenuity, and speed could shatter even the most disciplined defenses. The men were not just fighting for territory. They were dismantling the myth of German invincibility, 1 mile at a time. From observation posts to muddy riverbanks, the pattern was clear. Laughter had turned to disbelief, disbelief into panic, and panic into collapse. The once mocked Shermans were now symbols of unstoppable power. Von Kluge's orders came too late, often into empty fields. The Germans were losing not only ground, but confidence, cohesion, and morale. And yet the Third Army pressed on. Patton's vision had never been about cautious victories or methodical advances. It had been about seizing initiative, exploiting fear, and moving faster than anyone believed possible. Each mile gained was more than a physical triumph. It was a psychological one, a demonstration that even rivers, the supposed final bastions of defense, could be transformed into highways of conquest. Mini cliffhanger. With the heart of Germany now within reach, could the unstoppable Shermans maintain their pace, or would the final defenses prove that even audacity has limits? March 22, 1945. Across the shattered Rhine plains, the Shermans rolled like iron tides, mud splashing, engines growling, and treads tearing through the earth as if daring the land itself to stop them. From a distance, German generals could only watch helplessly. Every river they thought impassable had been crossed. Every defensive line they trusted had been overrun. Their mocking laughter from weeks earlier had long since vanished, replaced by fear, disbelief, and the cold certainty that the Americans had rewritten the rules of warfare. Patton's Third Army was now in full motion. Armored divisions carved deep into the Reich, infantry units consolidating gains, engineers bridging gaps, and artillery following like the echo of inevitability. The Americans weren't just advancing. They were unleashing momentum so overwhelming that Germany's best-trained units couldn't stop it. The Moselle had been the rehearsal, the Rhine the ultimate proving ground, and now nothing remained to slow the relentless tide. Inside the Sherman tanks, soldiers felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Lieutenant Donovan looked at the riverbanks behind him, bridges held, infantry advancing, towns liberated. He could almost feel the disbelief that had seized the enemy as they watched these, fragile, tanks defy expectations at every turn. It was more than victory. It was vindication. The audacity that had once seemed reckless had become unstoppable. The German command tried desperately to mount a counterattack, but it was already too late. Disorganized, fragmented, and demoralized, their units faltered under the weight of momentum. The Shermans, once mocked, had become a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Patton had transformed doubt into panic and hesitation into collapse. By nightfall, the Third Army had established secure positions across the Rhine, opening pathways for the final push into Germany. The rivers that had once symbolized insurmountable defense now lay conquered. What began as ridicule had become legend, a story of audacity, ingenuity, and relentless execution that would be told long after the guns fell silent. And somewhere, high above the Rhine, you could almost hear the echo of laughter, not German laughter this time, but the memory of it, now replaced by awe and respect for the men who turned mock tanks into harbingers of unstoppable momentum. Mini cliffhanger / closing reflection. The mocked Shermans had crossed rivers, shattered defenses, and shattered assumptions. One question remained: how many more myths of invincibility would fall before the Allies reached the heart of Germany? End.